Okay, we're
Okay.
recording.
Hi, this is Nicola Whitehall, and I'm be interviewing Matthew Robert Payne today. Matthew Robert Payne is a great friend of mine. I've written some books with him, about 3 books, I think. Or no, 2, and one on the way about Michael Jackson. I've known Matthew for a couple of years. I started reading some of his awesome books, and I particularly enjoyed his memoir, and I liked his books on prophetic evangelism and the Galactic Council and the Saints. Um, and so I connected with him and on email, and got to know him through Skype, and I found him to be a wonderful friend and a very caring and loving person who goes out of the way and really invests in his friends, and he's been a really he's really helped me grow in the Christian faith, and he's put me on his prophetic website. So what we've done, I've got to know him well over the last couple of years, and so I know a bit about his life. So I've prepared some questions for him on different areas. We've decided we'd do about 7 or 8 interviews on different themes about his life or different aspects of his life, and today we're going to do Matthew's family. So in particular, the most important people in Matthew's family, his mother and his father, and then at the end we're going to cover his older brother Rodney. So I'm just gonna. So are you ready, Matthew?
Yeah, I'm ready. That was a stellar introduction there, I have to say.
Good. Okay. So I'll just start off by asking you, how would you describe your early relationship with your father?
I first got to know my father as the father I hardly ever saw. In the early years of my life, my father worked 6 and 7 days, 12-hour shifts, and he was often gone before I woke up in the morning, and I was often asleep when he came home. And many children might adjust to a father that they see once a week, or once a fortnight, and they take it well. I took the absence of my father as a young child, that my father rejected me and didn't love me and didn't want to spend time with me. And so my early relationship with my father started off shaky. My father believed in discipline, and he would belt us and apply his Christian discipline to us. And as I grew up as a little boy, I knew that if I upset my mother too much, my mother wouldn't give me the belting, but my father would. So I felt sort of rejected in the early years, not seeing my father, and I had a father that would apply discipline to me.
Have you got a particular memory with your father, either negative or positive, any time in your childhood or later on?
I remember one time, I was telling this on another video that I did today. My father was an exceptional fisherman. I asked him once how good a fisherman he was, and he said that he was in the top 5% of Australian fishermen. He regularly went in a competition that would last the whole weekend, so you'd have to fit in sleep whenever you could from Friday night to Sunday night, and you just fish, and each fish was rated for its size and its weight, and the more different species of fish you caught, the more points you got. About 20 or 30 men used to go into competition all weekend, and my father would regularly get second place. And one of his best friends used to get first place all the time. And I asked my dad, if you are 5%, top 5%, what is your friend? And he said the top 1%. And I asked my father, because I grew up to be a teacher and I teach in my videos and books. Teachers often have a lot of questions. I asked my father, what makes him different? Why is he better than you? Why is he in the top 1% and you're in the top 5%? What did he do that's different to you? Why is he better? And my father got emotional with me. He said I wasn't prepared to be on my third marriage. And he essentially said that this friend of his worked all day and fished all night, worked Monday to Friday, and all weekend he was fishing. And his first two wives couldn't endure that. He was never home. And the only way his third marriage had lasted was that his third wife, he sort of keyed into it by the third marriage. And his third wife was an avid fisherman. So she spent a lot of time fishing with her husband to spend time with him. So that really touched me. That story touched me because I saw that my father was a good fisherman, number one. I saw a fisherman that regularly beat him in competitions who was in the top 1%. I saw my respect for that man, but I also heard something that proved to be a very important encounter that I had with my dad, that my dad wasn't prepared to lose my mother to divorce and wasn't prepared to be away from us children too long in order to be the best fisherman that he could be. My mum has said to me on many, many occasions that she doesn't know how my father coped through all the years of all his work, often on low incomes. She doesn't know how he would have coped without his fishing for sport. And the fact that he didn't strive for excellence in his sport as good as he could possibly have, because he wanted to keep his wife and children, made me very proud. I hardly ever have heard of another fisherman better than my father, and had tremendous respect. So another story that brings me joy is one day I was fishing with my father, and I had 15 fish and my father had 8, and I was beating him by a large margin. He was very competitive and he was starting to simmer a little bit with anger. My dad had anger issues, and it was kind of getting boring for me because I'd often sometimes I'd get ahead by 1 or 2 fish on my father from the hundreds of times we went fishing. And I'd be happy to be 1 or 2 fish ahead, but if we went for long enough, my father would overtake me again. But this time my father didn't seem to be closing the gap, but the gap, luckily enough, was getting wider and wider the longer we fished. So I told my dad I was tired and I went to sleep on a rock and let my father keep on fishing. And I did it because I didn't want him getting angry. And underneath, as a boy, I didn't want to see my father humiliated by some real lucky streak that I was having. But I've struggled all my life with self-esteem and being good. And that memory really stands out to me because I beat the best fisherman I know that night, and I had to give up in order to save my father's self-esteem.
Wow. And how did things continue on into your teen years with your father? Was it much the same, or?
My father had tremendous anger issues, and have you heard the expression, you may have heard the expression that you felt that you were walking on eggshells. Certain things used to set my father off, but you could never tell what set my father off. I know disagreeing with him and not doing what he tells you to do would set him off. I remember I was an adult. I was about 25, 26. Had a car. I came home for Christmas, and my father had a rental house, and he was living in this rental house. That he had a main house, and he had a house, that investment property, and he used to want the cars parked in the backyard. And so you'd drive through the garage and park your car in the backyard, and all the cars are up there, and then you drive back through the garage to go out. And I parked my car facing the back of the backyard. I didn't turn my car around and face it forward towards the garage so I could just drive out naturally. But I left my car that way so I could just reverse through the garage, and I didn't mind. I just didn't bother. I couldn't be bothered turning my car around. I was a cab driver at the time, and had enough of driving, was very experienced at driving. Anyway, I come inside, and I was an adult and wasn't living at home. And my father said, "Turn your car around." I said, "No, I'm happy with the way it is." And my whole family was sitting in the kitchen. And my father raised his voice. He'd always raise his voice, and everyone would jump, responding to his anger. And he raised his voice and he said, "I said, turn your car around." And I was sick and tired of getting in trouble and having my father lash out in anger at me for something that I didn't do wrong. And I was certainly getting old enough to stand up to him. This time I got my keys out of my pocket and I threw them at him. I said, "Catch, if you got a problem with the car being that way, you turn it around yourself." And he exploded. He said, "You're under my roof. You do what I tell you to do." And I'm not going to raise my voice to the level of shouting that my father did. He said, "For the last time, turn your car around." And I said, "For the last time, I'm not going to turn my car around. And no amount of shouting is going to make me turn my car around. And if you've got an issue with it, turn it around yourself." And that's the finish of this argument. And the whole house was seeing a showdown, and no one ever stood up to my father. And they were just seeing this showdown, like the Battle of David and Goliath. And you see these biblical proportion fights in the Bible, but you don't live to witness one in your own house. And this is supposed to be happy time where everyone's happy at Christmas. And my father said, "Pack your bags, put them in your car, and go home. You're not welcome in my house if you don't do what I tell you to do. So you won't be spending Christmas with me in my house." And at that time, something happened. A dynamic had changed that day, and something happened that I never expected. My mother stood to her feet and shouted at my father. And she was livid in tears. She was in tears. And she said, "He's a grown adult. Everyone doesn't have to do what you tell them to do. He is not going home for Christmas. He's staying here." And my father stormed out, fight or flight. My father stormed out and was out of the house for 2 hours. And when he came back, it was okay for me to stay for Christmas, because the one thing that I found out off my mother was that my father didn't like going without sexual relations with my mum, and he didn't like to cross the line too much with my mother, because it seemed to affect him in the bedroom, and he could see a possibility of that happening, and so he backed down. So that was one time that was a bit extreme, but it was just me standing up for myself and my rights as a man.
Yeah, sounds good. How in the end how did you deal with all over all that time, the childhood, the teenage years, even as an adult? How did you deal with your dad's rejection and anger over the years?
Well, most of the time I learned not to disagree with him and stand up to him. As I got older, I got more self-esteem and felt more responsible. But underneath, I really had no love for my father. I've never been a person who has hated, but I never put that much energy into a relationship. But I used to keep on going through the one day I rang up and my mother, and I said I was sleeping with prostitutes again. I started my addiction, and she said, "Stop sleeping with prostitutes. You'll get demons." And I said, "Mum, the problem's bigger than demons. I'm in such a bad way. I need company. I need someone to touch me and someone to love me. And you just can't tell a heroin addict to take a needle out of his arm. A heroin addict is in pain." And I was giving my mum a bit of a dressing down for the way she treated me religiously all the time. And I said, we know a drug rehabilitation farm, or we're friends with them. And I said, it takes John at that farm a year to get a heroin addict to an emotional state where he doesn't need the heroin in his arm to cope with his pain. I said, "Mum, I'm in pain and I'm sleeping with prostitutes." And she said, "Well, you need to stop because you'll get demons and it'll just get worse." And I said, "Mum, you never understand." She hung up the phone in anger with me. I rang back about half an hour later, and my dad answered the phone. He said, "What are you doing ringing this house?" And I said, "I want to ring to Mum." He said, "You're not going to speak to my wife." He didn't even call her Mum. And he said, "Your last conversation made her really upset, and you've got no right to speak to my wife like that." I said, "Dad, I'm in a bad way. I feel like killing myself." And my father said to me, "Go ahead and kill yourself. You were a mistake. You weren't planned. You wrecked my life. We had no plans for you, and you've been nothing but a pain in the ass ever since you've been alive. So go ahead. You're probably gutless. You probably won't do it. But go ahead. You'll make my day. Go and kill yourself and get out of this life because we're sick and tired of you." And that wasn't the answer. It's certainly not the sort of thing you should tell someone who's suicidal. I got off the phone and I swore to myself that I would stay alive just to annoy my dad. And he'd always said that he'd always said that I was loved just as much as the other children. But the truth came out in that anger that day, that he blamed me, and he blamed me for wrecking his happy life with two children. I was the third child, and he wasn't prepared financially for that. And I got off the phone, and within a week of that phone call, I decided that I was sick and tired of my dad being the life of the party and the person that everyone loved. And no one knew that he was a tyrant and this angry, violent man at home. And so I swore to myself that I'll stay alive, and when he is buried, when we're at the funeral, I'll, instead of dropping a flower on his grave, I'll undo my fly and piss on his grave in front of all his friends and the 200 people that would be at the funeral. and I'd do that sign of disrespect of my father. And if ever anyone spoke up, I'd give them a mouthful of what a tyrant he is and what a whole pack of garbage everyone was talking. And none of you really knew our father like our family knows. And so I promised myself that I was going to do that, and I was going to stay alive until he died, and I was going to have that last word on his life.
Wow. Later on, you said God gave you a difficult choice about saving your dad's soul or many other souls. Can you tell us about this?
One time had been up for a couple of days. I was talking to Jesus, and Jesus said, Matthew, I'm going to give you a decision to make, and I want you to give me a decision. He said, imagine if I was to tell you that I was going to use you to save 10,000 souls, and they would not go to hell and they'd go to heaven because of you preaching, or I was going to send your father to hell. He said, I'm giving you a choice now. You can save 10,000 souls from going to hell, but if you choose that choice, I'm going to send your father to hell. Or you can save your father and he can go to heaven, and I'll send the 10,000 souls to hell and you won't preach and save them. He said, what's your decision? I said, can I think about it? And he said, yeah, sure, take your time. And I agonized for 3 days. And finally I said to Jesus, I don't think you've got the qualification to send my father to hell. But if you're giving me a choice and this is real, I'd be the most selfish person in the world to request that my father go to heaven and 10,000 innocent people go to hell. Send my father to hell and let me save the 10,000. And Jesus said, thank you for your answer. I'm not going to send your father to hell. But how did you feel for those 3 days? And I said, I went through a living hell myself. And he said, well, I put you through that agony so you could appreciate what souls mean to me. Every living human being means the same to me as your father means to you. And I want you to consider that when you spend your life doing life with people, that just as much as you didn't want your father going to hell, I don't want anyone else going to hell. And it was an amazing lesson for me, which thrust me into being like a massive evangelist.
Wow, cool. Can you describe the events where a visiting speaker spoke life into you and also confronted your father?
I had a friend that really loved me, and he was at my mother's church, my mother and father's church. I've always been close to my mum, and so that's why I would say it's my mother's church. This friend really loved me and took me out to restaurants when I was visiting my hometown at Christmas or whenever I came home from holidays. He saw a preacher overseas that was anointed, that was amazing, and it's the best preacher he'd ever seen. And he went up to the preacher and he says, you need to come to Australia and preach at my church. And the preacher said, I don't need to do anything. And I certainly don't need to go to a lukewarm Western nation who are obstinate Christians. That very few of them are actually even going to heaven. So I certainly don't take orders from you, and I don't think I'll be coming to your country. Thank you very much. And this guy persisted, took him out for dinner, got to know him a little bit, this preacher. Where he got his travel schedule off him whenever he was in a city close to this man. he went and seen him preach and worked and worked and worked on this man and convinced him to come to Australia. And the man didn't decide for my friend. The man decided to, this apostle decided to come to Australia because the Holy Spirit ordered him to, said that you need to do this. And my friend had me in mind because he knew I was bipolar and I said some crazy things from time to time. He was worried about me, and he wanted a spiritual expert to sit down face to face with me and help me. And he knew that this was the most anointed preacher he'd ever met. He knew if anyone was going to have an answer for Matthew, his friend, that this guy Mutu would have an answer. And so this guy flew me up from Sydney. My mother said I wouldn't come to Coffs Harbour halfway through the year just to hear a visiting speaker. And my friend said, I've flown him over to Australia to meet Matthew, to help Matthew. He's got to come. And my mum said he doesn't like the 9-hour train trip up and back. And the only way he comes is once a year because he flies. And he says, what do I need to do? Pay for him to fly. And Mum said, I'm not going to talk to him. Here's his mobile phone number, his cell phone number. You call him, and if you want him, you probably have to pay for him to fly. And he did. He paid for airfares and said, I really need to meet this preacher. And I was impressed that my friend had spent $300 on airfares for me. I came and we had this meeting that was set up, and I met this man, Mutu, and Mutu talked to me for about an hour, and he said, so let me get this straight. You talk to Jesus, you talk to God the Father, and you talk to Mary Magdalene. And I said, yeah. He said, all of those voices you're speaking to are false. He said, you're not speaking to God, you're not speaking to Jesus, and you're not speaking to Mary Magdalene. They were all false. And he gave me examples out of what I'd said, and enough to convince me that I was being deceived, and I was being deceived by a spirit I called the false Jesus, and masquerading as Jesus. And I did start off as a youth speaking to Jesus, and somehow through my mental illness or something, we had demons pretending to be Jesus the Father and Mary. So he told me if I wanted to hear God the Father speak, that I should read the Old Testament prophets. Any prophet, just read a prophet and you'll hear God speak. If you want to hear Jesus speak, just read the Gospels and keep on reading the Gospels, and Jesus will speak to you. And totally stop speaking to that Mary Magdalene that you think is Mary Magdalene. And it was life-changing for me, and I did what he said. As Mutu had came from me, and he'd been flown over from Malaysia to meet me, and he'd been told meeting me was the main reason he'd been invited to the church. And so Mutu knew I was very special to Mark, my friend, and Mutu knew the reason that he was here was to help me, and he'd given me an hour and a half of his time and helped me and told me what I needed to do. And I was shaken, but I trusted this guy, and I'd heard him preach, and I'd never heard anyone preach like that. And Mutu was leaving the house, and my dad stopped Mutu to engage him in conversation. And Mutu said to my dad, "What are you talking to me for, Bob? You're a whitewashed tomb. You may think that people don't see you. You're all white on the outside, but inside is wickedness and dead man's bones." And my father went white as a ghost because I was next to Mutu saying goodbye. My father went white with shock, and Mutu just walked on. And for that visit for a week, Mutu didn't speak to my father, didn't address my father, and totally treated my father like a leper. And the next meeting, when he came back the next year, he advised my father to read 2 chapters of the Old Testament every day, 2 chapters of the New Testament every day, and 1 Psalm and 1 proverb each day. And Mutu was the most spiritual man I've met in my life, and he'd discerned, been told by the Lord that my father had a major anger issue. My father was unrepentant and had no desire to change his habit, and that anger issue would have taken my father to hell. Like Jesus said, it was real. My decision those 3 years before had been a real decision. Jesus was talking about my father going to hell, and nothing had ever changed my father. And my father was reading Proverbs every day, and if you read the book of Proverbs, you'll see so many times it says an angry man is a fool. There's no wisdom in an angry man. You can't trust an angry man. An angry man has no wisdom, and it just insults people with a spirit of anger all the way through Proverbs. And I saw over a couple of years my father get free of this bondage of anger over his life. And my father, reading the Bible faithfully, he'd been so severely rebuked by Mutu that I saw my father read the Bible. I still see my father reading the Bible, but for at least 2 years he was reading the Bible faithfully. For 2 years, reading 2 chapters of the Old Testament, 2 chapters of the New Testament, and a psalm and a proverb each day. And I saw my father totally transformed.
Wow. And I just remember I'm not sure if you shared it or not, about how Mutu said something to your father about your walk with the Lord, that was shared.
Yeah, I was out at a meal. We were having a meal after a meeting. It was about 8:30 at night. We'd probably had a meeting at 5 o'clock. We all went out for dinner. It was about 15 to 20 of us. I was sitting up one end of the table with Mark and a few of Mark's friends, and Mutu was sitting down the other end of the table with my father and a few other people. And when I get mania, or when I get high as a manic depressive, when I get excited, I raise my voice. And Mutu, halfway through the dinner, Mutu shouted up to me, "Matthew, quieten your voice." And I said, "You talk to your people, I'll talk to mine." He says, "That's fine that you talk to your people and I'll talk to mine, that's fine, but your voice is too loud, and the people are here to see me, they're not here to see you. I'm the important guest, and your voice is making it hard for people to hear me." And I said, "Oh, I'm sorry, Mutu. When I get excited, my voice gets loud, and I don't realise that I'm loud. Thank you for telling me." Even though I was in the wrong, Mutu had so much grace and love that he could bring correction in a beautiful way. And it was so foreign to what I knew in my father. And I went back to telling my story, and Mutu went back and he said, "Bob," he said, "yeah," he said, I'm not sure if people can see this video, but he said, "Your son and the Holy Spirit fly together like that." And my father said, "What do you mean?" He said, "In 20 years I've been in ministry, I've never seen anyone so close to the Holy Spirit than your son." And Dad said, "What do you mean?" He said, 80% of what your son says is the Holy Spirit speaking. And you'll see in Corinthians that that Paul says that the wisdom of God is foolishness to men. And most of your life, Matthew's life, he hasn't been accepted by Christians. hasn't been accepted by Christian leadership. He's been written off as a fool, and that's because he's been coming out with the wisdom of God, and he's being led by the wisdom of God. He's being led by the Holy Spirit, and people think he's a fool because he's coming out with so much wisdom. Dad came home and said, Mutu said something about you today, Matthew, that would make any father proud. And my mother said, what did he say? And he says, I can't tell you. Matthew will get too much of pride, and he'll get too much of an ego. And my mother said, you can't say something like that and then not say it. Trust God that Matthew won't get pride, and just tell us what he said. And he came out with that story, and I was very happy with my dad that day, because I've still been suicidal with a lot of pain in my life, and that's one of the most precious things anyone, especially someone so qualified in ministry, has ever said about me.
Wow. And after all this interaction with Mutu and all this other stuff, and your father spending time reading the Bible and Psalms and Proverbs and the prophets, there was a time when you and your father were on a boat and something changed in your relationship. What was that?
It's hard to talk about this without crying. One day we're on a ferry in Sydney. Whenever my parents came to Sydney to visit me, sometimes they'd come down once a year to visit me because I wouldn't go to Coffs Harbour more than once a year. And they wanted to see me, and we'd always go to a beach called Manly, which you could catch this beautiful ferry ride to Manly, and it would take 45 minutes there and back. And we'd go out to a restaurant and have a beer and then come back. And they were my favourite days. I always liked going to Manly. I like taking, if I ever had friends, I like taking friends to Manly. And on the way back, my father was talking, and then he stopped and he filled up with tears. And I said, Dad, what's the matter? And he said, Matthew, I'm so sorry for the way I treated you as you grew up. And, you know, they're just simple words. I'm sorry. But they're so powerful, you know. They're so powerful. And that day I decided that, you know, I was going to say some very nice words at my father's funeral. And father's got Alzheimer's now, and I don't know how much longer I'm going to have him. And I think if I get a chance to speak at his funeral, I'd say some things that would make everyone smile.
Yeah. So you've seen a lot of changes in him now?
Yeah, he's happy. We joke on the phone all the time. When I ring up my mother, quite often when I speak to my father, we joke, and he asked me if I've got any money that I can give him, that can he get a loan off me. And he's very good at saving money and has been all his life. And I'll say to my father, I need $5,000 for a couple of books. Can you get me some money? I need to publish these books. And, you know, I say to my mother sometimes, I haven't got any money to give Dad. I spend it all on my books. And my mother laughs. She said, he's only joking with you. He'd never take money off you. It's just his way of connecting with you. And sometimes I've felt that Dad saved so much money, it would just be so good to, you know, spend some money on him. And we get a carton of beer. I don't drink. You know, I don't need alcohol in my life. And I don't drink, but when I go home for Christmas for 2 weeks, we always buy a carton of beer and have one beer a day over 14 days, or 2 beers a day between us. We have it with lemonade, and it tastes really nice. And we always joke about who's going to pay for the beer this year, because it costs $50. And yeah, we just joke about money. And Dad hasn't got a lot of subjects that he talks to me about, but he's very proud of his son. And he's this year he's said it to a lot of times to me, when are you coming up? And he's losing his memory. And my mother's told me multiple times that Dad is so looking forward to you coming home this year. So it's remarkable what one preacher can do to your father. And Mutu saved my relationship with my father and totally transformed it. The Bible transformed my father, and it's powerful and it's living. And I know I'm called to preach the gospel. I just hope that I can affect people's lives like Mutu affected mine.
Yeah.
This is
very powerful story.
This has gone on. I'm sort of getting tired, so we might have to talk about my mother and my brother another day.
Okay.
If that's okay.
That's your father done?
Yeah. Do you know how long we've been talking?
No.
Yeah, I think it's at least half an hour. So we'll may talk about my mother and my brother the next time. Thank you for your questions. Thanks for the thought that went into the questions. I hope that as you listen to this, that some of my story impacted me, impacted you. And if you got anything to say, please comment below the video. To get a prophecy of me, or get a prophecy of Nicola, please visit the website who's in the description tag under the video. Hope that you learned some things about me, and I'm just not sharing teachings, but I'm actually a real human that grew up with a difficult father. Thanks, Nicola, for doing this with us today.
Been a delight, Matthew.
Thank you so much.
It's been an absolute delight.
Well, is there any last words you want to say?
No, I just think that's a really redemptive story. It's almost like the story of the prodigal son, the prodigal father coming back to the son.
Yeah. It's makes me emotional. I've been up for a couple of days now, and I'm emotional. But I so look forward to going home in a couple of weeks' time. And I really, because I suppose if you have alcohol every day or every week, or alcohol's in your house, I suppose alcohol's nothing special to you. But these beers, having these beers and lemonade is just so beautiful. It's so tasty to me, and I really look forward to it. And this year, I've promised my mum that I'm going to buy a couple of kilos of prawns, and they're like $35 a kilo, and that'll be $70, and the beer will be $50. It'll be $120, and we can just sit down with a few beers and eat all these prawns. And it may be the last year. A year ago, Jesus said I only had 2 years left with my father, and this may be the last Christmas that he'll be able to speak to me. And so it was really poignant and really needed for me to share what I shared today. And thank you for coming up with the idea to interview me, Nicola.
Oh, it's a pleasure. It's yeah, your stories are really remarkable and very deep, and I think a lot of people can relate to these on many levels. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. We'll close off now. So I hope you can write me a comment if you read this and listen to this and you like it. God bless.